渋谷方面行きが参ります。まもなくですから黄色い点字ブロックまでお下がりください。Your attention please. The train bound for Shibuya.
The night is warm and still. Cicadas whisper from the trees, a television hums behind a paper screen, and the suburbs north of Tokyo glow in a soft, tired light. Laundry hangs on quiet balconies. A late train shudders through the dark and fades. It is the kind of calm that makes you think nothing terrible could live here. The kind of calm that hides things. In a small upstairs room at the edge of Saitama, a young man sits alone with a mountain of videotapes and magazines stacked like walls. The curtains are always closed. The air smells of dust and warm plastic. The blue face of a tube TV flickers across his glasses and leaves the rest of the room in shadow. His name is Tsutomu Miyazaki. He was born in August 1962, west of Tokyo, into a family that ran a printing business and believed that work and quiet solved most problems. His childhood problem was not one he could solve. His wrists were malformed and would not bend, hands fixed in a way that made simple gestures awkward. In school he hid them under sleeves, but children noticed difference without being taught. He learned to go small and silent. He avoided sports days. He learned to pass through hallways like a shadow, to sit at the edges of class pictures. Teachers called him polite and distant. A neighbor would later say they never saw him with friends. It was not dramatic. It was a long, low tide pulling him away from everyone else. Machines made sense when people did not. He loved cameras and tape decks and the way a lens could pin a moment to paper. He learned how to service televisions, how to clean a recorder head with steady patience, how to catalog tapes until a shelf became a grid. After high school he studied photography at a junior college, then went home to work in his father's shop. The rhythm suited him. Paper, ink, plates, type. You do the steps and the machine rewards you. Evenings he climbed to his room, closed the door, and let the city fall away. A stack of horror films became 2 stacks, then 10, then a life. He recorded news broadcasts overnight, and watched them in the morning, rewinding the worst moments as if repetition could explain them. He told himself it was curiosity. Alone long enough, any habit can become a logic. Family was present but far. His father was often away on business. His mother kept the home in order but did not enter that upstairs room. Younger sisters thought him strange and left him alone. When he tried to speak, it came out thin. When he felt shame, it lodged like a stone in the throat and stayed. At dinner he sat, ate, answered when asked, and returned to the blue light. Outside, Japan was entering its bright late 80s moment. Money moved. Neon climbed higher. Arcades were full, commuter trains packed. Inside, nothing moved at all. By his mid-20s the quiet had hardened. He drove aimlessly at night on clean roads that looped through tidy neighborhoods. He parked near playgrounds after sunset and watched empty swings twist a little on their chains. He learned the small pulse of the suburbs. When children walked home with backpacks, the streets looked safe because they always had. He practiced being harmless. He practiced how to make his posture say you can trust me. He practiced patience. He kept notebooks. Some pages were observations about light and angles and the way faces change when people think they are unobserved. Some pages wandered into darker places, snatches of fantasy put down in flat handwriting as if that could keep them contained. He clipped headlines about disappearances. He cut still frames from rented horror films and taped them beside those clippings. At first it was an arrangement. Then it began to look like a plan. In August 1988 the heat lay on the pavement from noon until midnight, and the cicadas never stopped. On the 22nd, one day after his birthday, he drove through a residential corner of Saitama and saw a little girl chalking shapes on the pavement outside her building. Her name was Mari Kano, 4 years old. Her mother had stepped inside for a moment. The street was quiet. He parked. He spoke softly. He made something ordinary sound inviting. A moment later she was in the passenger seat with a seatbelt fastened by a careful hand. He drove toward the green rise of hills where the city lets go. It is important to say plainly what happened next without dwelling on what should not be repeated. He took her into the trees. He ended her life there, in a place that looks the same from every angle. He left her, returned later, and treated what remained as if it were a possession. The act was cold. The aftermath was colder. At home he watched the evening news speak her name. He recorded the broadcast. He rewound the segment. He watched the photograph of a smiling child appear on the screen and disappear and appear again under a red headline. Her parents handed out flyers at a station entrance while commuters flowed around them. He clipped the paper the next morning and filed it. In the shop downstairs, type-met paper and work orders were filled. In the room upstairs, a boundary that had kept his thoughts behind glass was gone. He had stepped through. Japanese police began with the usual circles: family, neighbors, the last person to see her. They searched parks, culverts, drainages, and the scrub at the edge of footpaths. Nothing. The country watched because missing children are not common in places where order is expected. Parents walked their kids to school for a week, then 2, then longer. The fears settled into routines. The calendar turned. The chalk drawings washed from the pavement. He drove more after that. He learned where narrow streets emptied into fields and where a path slips into trees without a fence. He learned which commuter lots emptied by dinner time, and which vending machines stood beside roads no one drives after 10. He learned the times when a small form might be alone and unseen. He told himself that if he could arrange everything, if he could control every variable, he could still that ache that had become his only companion. The story he told himself was a lie, but lies repeated in quiet become walls. On an October afternoon he saw 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa walking along a river path with the ease of a child who knows the area and trusts it. The sky was a clear high blue that early autumn does so well. He coaxed her near the car. He guided her inside. He drove to the wooded outskirts again. It was fast. It was methodical. Later, her shoes were found placed neatly by the water as if a child had set them there herself. That small, cruel detail traveled farther than any rumor. Parents stood at windows and stared at the street that evening. Patrol cars glided by more often. Officers spoke softly at doors and took notes. The broadcast showed a line of brown water and a pair of shoes that could have belonged to any child. In his room, the tape recorder clicked as it reached the end and stopped. December brings early dark to the suburbs and breath fogs in front of mouths and bikes rattle home faster. On a recent Sunday, 4-year-old Kanamba left a friend's birthday and began the short walk back. He was waiting in the car he had used before. It is not necessary to rehearse every action, only to say he took her, and that by morning she was found in a place that does not forget. Nearby, her clothing was folded. Investigators felt the bottom drop out of the case. 3 little girls in 4 months within a small distance is not coincidence. The word everyone avoided found its way into print: serial. The city shifted. Playgrounds emptied early. School routes were redrawn. News anchors adopted the careful cadence reserved for national grief. Police increased patrols and scheduled press conferences and asked the public to note license plates and faces and patterns. There were no useful patterns yet. Only a direction of travel, away from safety into fear. In his room the stacks climbed higher. 6,000 tapes would later be counted in that space. But at the time the number only felt like a wall high enough to keep the world out and keep his fantasies in. He watched horror at night and the noon news at breakfast. He paused on the faces of weeping parents and uncertain officers and rewound. He cut new clippings and placed them beside the old. The upstairs door stayed shut. The family below heard footsteps at odd hours and the murmur of a television through a ceiling, and said nothing because saying something would bring whatever lived up there into the light. Across the winter and into spring, Japan lived between two truths. In public, everything looked the same. Trains arrived on time. Lines formed politely. Children sang in classrooms and bowed at the ends of lessons. At home, mothers walked their kids to the bathroom at night and stood outside the door. Fathers checked locks twice. The sound of cicadas would return soon, and with it the warm fog of summer. When it did, the quiet man in the upstairs room would be ready to do the worst thing he had yet imagined. By early summer 1989, the heat had returned, heavy and unmoving. The air shimmered above asphalt, and even the wind through the trees carried a thickness that made sound seem slower. The days were long, and nights never fully dark, the kind of season when Japan feels suspended between stillness and exhaustion. It was during this time that Tsutomu Miyazaki met his final victim. Her name was Ayako Nemoto. 7 years old. Bright, talkative, and endlessly curious, she lived with her parents in a neighborhood that looked like every other one in Saitama. Narrow streets, trimmed hedges, the sound of children's sandals slapping the pavement in the afternoons. Her life was small, safe, ordinary. She loved drawing and stories, and her parents described her as a child who never met a stranger. That trust, the innocence that should have been a protection, was what drew Miyazaki to her. He saw her one evening near a public park, watching the passing cars. He pulled over, rolled down his window, and spoke in the same calm tone he always used, a voice that could have belonged to a teacher, or a neighbor, or an uncle. He told her he wanted to show her some photographs, maybe take her picture, and she smiled. The world hadn't yet taught her that not every adult means well. The road he drove that day wound away from the neighborhoods into a strip of half-rural, half-forgotten space, where weeds overtook fences and vending machines buzzed beside empty lots. He knew these places well, the way someone who walks alone every night does. He parked where no one could see and led her down a dirt path through the trees. What happened next was methodical, almost ritualistic. He strangled her quickly, quietly, and when the sound stopped, he sat beside her body for a long time. Later, when asked, he said he didn't remember what he thought about in that moment, only that everything around him felt still, as if time had stepped away. He left her there and drove home. But as before, that wasn't the end. He returned days later, when decomposition had begun, and carried parts of her remains away. He photographed them, recorded videos, and catalogued everything with detached precision. The boundaries between curiosity, fantasy, and cruelty had long since dissolved. His camera had become the only mirror he trusted, proof that he existed, that something he touched stayed still when everything else slipped away. Weeks later, he mailed parts of her remains to her family. The package arrived without warning. A cardboard box, light, unassuming, bearing only their address. Inside was horror, wrapped in newspaper. Alongside it, a crude note scrawled in a shaky hand. "Now you can stop searching for her." The image of Ayako's parents opening that package remains one of the most haunting moments in Japan's modern history. Her mother screamed until she collapsed. Her father tried to call the police but couldn't form words. When the news broke, the country froze. For days, the story led every broadcast, every newspaper headline, every whispered conversation at work or school. Journalists flooded the Nomoto family's quiet street. Camera crews camped outside their home, capturing footage of neighbors crying, of flowers piling at the doorstep. Newscasters spoke in hushed voices, using words like evil and unimaginable. The police promised action, but behind the scenes they were overwhelmed. The murderer seemed to vanish into the city's sprawl after every crime, leaving nothing behind but terror. Miyazaki, meanwhile, lived as if none of it concerned him. He continued going to work, sitting at his typesetting desk, nodding politely to his colleagues. He rented new videos, developed photographs, bought more blank tapes. His parents noticed that he had become thinner, paler, but they said nothing. His sisters avoided him. His father, frustrated by his reclusiveness, told him to get out and live in the world. He nodded, then went upstairs and closed the door again. The double life continued until one humid afternoon in July 1989, when his control finally faltered. He was seen loitering near a playground, camera in hand, watching a small girl. Her father noticed, approached, and confronted him. Miyazaki panicked, snapping a few pictures before turning and running. The father chased him but lost him after a few blocks. In his haste, Miyazaki left behind his car. When police impounded the vehicle, they found inside a small trove of evidence. Photographs of young girls, children's clothing, and several videotapes. The tapes were enough to obtain a warrant for his home. The search that followed would become one of the most infamous in Japanese criminal history. The officers who entered the Miyazaki residence described it as like stepping into another world. The smell hit first, the thick, stale odor of dust and old electronics. Piles of VHS tapes towered to the ceiling, labeled with strange codes. Magazines, newspapers, and notebooks covered the floor. On the walls were photographs of the missing girls, cut out from news articles and arranged almost reverently. One officer would later say, "It was like being inside the mind of something that no longer understood people." The discovery of the tapes, more than 6,000 in total, shocked the public. Many contained horror films, pornography, or news coverage of the missing children. But others were worse. Hidden among the stacks were home videos documenting his crimes, as well as recordings of his victims' remains. Each one was labeled with meticulous handwriting. The Japanese media exploded. News anchors spoke of him as a new kind of killer, one shaped by isolation and obsession rather than rage. Psychologists speculated live on air about how loneliness could mutate into monstrosity. Politicians demanded tighter censorship of violent and erotic media. The word otaku, which had once meant simply enthusiast or fan, suddenly became synonymous with danger. Anyone who loved anime, horror, or photography was viewed with suspicion. But inside his cell, when he was first interrogated, Miyazaki barely reacted. He spoke quietly, using formal language. Sometimes he referred to himself as "we." Other times he mentioned a rat man that controlled his actions. His calm unnerved even veteran detectives. They expected denial, anger, bargaining. Instead, he answered questions with the detached precision of someone explaining a process he no longer cared about. One investigator later said that during an interview, Miyazaki looked at the wall clock and commented on how beautiful the sound of the ticking was. He smiled faintly, as if nothing around him, not the accusations, not the photographs spread across the table, held any real meaning. The story dominated Japan for months. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding signs calling him a monster, demanding justice. Inside, reporters filled every seat, sketching his slight frame, his glasses, his emotionless stare. When he spoke, it was in the same polite tone he'd used to address his neighbors. He described his actions not as crimes, but as curiosities, moments of wanting to know what would happen. The psychologists called to examine him were divided. Some diagnosed severe personality disorder, possibly schizoid or borderline. Others claimed psychosis. But one expert said something that stayed with the public for years. He is not mad. He is simply empty. That emptiness was what frightened people most. The trial of Tsutomu Miyazaki began under a weight of expectation unlike any Japan had seen in decades. It was not just a matter of guilt that had already been settled by the overwhelming evidence, but a deeper need to understand. The court had become a stage for a nation asking itself what could turn one of its own into something that seemed so far beyond human feeling. On the first day, photographers crowded the steps of the Tokyo District Court, their flashes bright against the gray morning. Inside, the benches filled long before the session began. Families of the victims sat in the front row, their faces tight, their hands clasped. Behind them were journalists from every major outlet, sketch artists, and even foreign correspondents who had flown in after reading about Japan's Otaku killer. When he was led in, the room went still. He was small, pale, and expressionless, wearing a plain shirt, his hair cut short, his glasses clean and simple. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man you might pass on the street and forget moments later. That was what made it so unsettling. When the prosecutor read the charges, 4 counts of murder, desecration of corpses, abduction, and intimidation, Miyazaki stood without emotion. He admitted everything. His voice was low but clear, his answers polite. When asked why, he said, "I wanted to keep them as they were, before they could change." He did not elaborate. The defense argued insanity. They described a man consumed by delusion, unable to distinguish reality from the fantasies that filled his tapes. They cited his childhood deformity, the bullying, the neglect, the crushing isolation of his adult life. They brought in psychiatrists who spoke of hallucinations and identity fragmentation. One claimed that the rat man Miyazaki described was a secondary personality created to contain his guilt. Another disagreed, saying, "He knew what he did. He understood the rules. He simply did not care." The prosecution leaned into that second opinion. They showed his detailed notes, his organized photographs, his calm behavior after each crime. They showed that he went to work, followed the news, watched his victims' families on television, and clipped their interviews for his collection. They argued that this was not madness. This was choice, executed with patience and precision. The proceedings lasted years. Japan's legal system moved slowly, and this case was treated with exceptional care. Public opinion hardened quickly. The idea of the Otaku Murderer dominated television talk shows. Panels debated whether technology, pornography, or media violence had created a new kind of killer. Politicians proposed regulations on comic book content and late-night programming. Toy stores removed certain horror-themed items from their shelves. Meanwhile, the families of the victims endured endless exposure. They became unwilling public figures, asked to speak on camera about grief that could not be expressed in words. Ayako Nemoto's mother once said softly to a reporter, "Every time they show his face, I lose her again." The public fascination turned to revulsion, and then to fatigue. By the late 1990s, the trial was still not over. Miyazaki remained in custody, undergoing psychiatric evaluations, writing letters to journalists, and occasionally drawing small cartoons in his cell. He was disturbingly calm, as though the trial were something happening to someone else. When the verdict finally came in 1997, the courtroom was silent. The judge read each count carefully, his voice steady. Tsutomu Miyazaki was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. The judge's statement described him as a man whose crimes reveal an absence of humanity so complete that the law offers no other response. The defense immediately appealed. For nearly a decade, the appeals process dragged on. The media, once ravenous, began to look elsewhere, but every few years his name resurfaced, whenever another isolated young man committed a crime, or whenever debates about otaku culture flared up again. When his final appeal was rejected in 2006, Miyazaki reportedly showed no emotion. He said only, "I knew what I did. I knew what would happen." 2 years later, in June 2008, he was executed. He walked calmly to the gallows. His last meal was a small dish of noodles and rice. He did not request a priest. He did not speak a final word. News of his execution reached the public in the afternoon. The justice minister confirmed it at a press conference, his tone subdued. Reporters asked if the death penalty brought closure to the families. The minister replied, "There is no closure for such things." That night, Japanese television replayed archival footage of the case. The police cars outside his home, the stacks of videotapes, the photographs of the victims. But the tone was different now. There was less anger, more exhaustion. After 20 years, the story had burned itself into the national conscience. What lingered wasn't just horror, but a question that never found an answer. How could such cruelty grow out of such ordinary soil? Miyazaki's parents lived quietly after his arrest. His father, humiliated and unable to bear the shame, eventually took his own life. His mother retreated into seclusion. Neighbors who once greeted them at the market began to cross the street instead. His sisters moved away. The family's printing business closed. Their name had become unmentionable. The victims' families carried their grief in silence. On anniversaries, they left flowers at the sites where their daughters had vanished. Some refused interviews entirely. Others continued to speak, hoping that remembering might protect others from similar pain. But memory has its own cruelty. It keeps the wound open even when the world wants to forget. In the years after his death, Tsutomu Miyazaki's story continued to appear in documentaries, true crime books, and university studies. The 2011 Japanese film Cold Fish was loosely inspired by him, though it shifted the setting and characters. Television specials revisited the case whenever new serial crimes occurred, using his image as shorthand for a certain kind of horror, the soft-spoken neighbor who hides a void behind a polite bow. Psychologists now teach his case as a study in emotional detachment, how sustained isolation can hollow out empathy until only curiosity remains. In classrooms, his childhood photos are shown beside case notes describing his obsession with control. Students are told to notice not just what he did, but what his world looked like before he did it, a society that prized quiet over confrontation, normality over understanding. That, in the end, was what made his story so deeply Japanese, and so deeply human. It wasn't only about murder, it was about what happens when loneliness becomes a language and no one listens. In Hano and Saitama, where the crimes occurred, people still remember the summer of fear. Older residents still walk their children home in pairs. A few of the wooded areas where the bodies were found have been paved over or built upon, but locals say that in the heat of August, when the cicadas are loud and the light turns amber, the quiet there still feels heavier than it should. Because even after decades, the story of Tsutomu Miyazaki remains a warning, not about monsters in the dark, but about the emptiness that can grow behind a closed door, unnoticed, until it begins to speak in the voice of something we no longer recognize. The years following Miyazaki's execution were quieter on the surface, but beneath that quiet the echoes of his crimes rippled through Japan's collective psyche. His story didn't end when he was hanged. It continued to live, in small ways, in the corners of convenience stores where people avoided eye contact with withdrawn young men, in the uneasy jokes about otaku types that hid genuine fear, and in the way parents hesitated to let their children walk home alone at dusk. The media had built his mythology so completely that even long after his death, the image of his cluttered room and those 6,000 tapes became symbols in themselves. They were shorthand for the idea that loneliness, technology, and desire could merge into something unrecognizable. For years, every news anchor who discussed violent crime seemed to mention him by name, as though he were the origin of all later horrors. He had become a ghost in the circuitry of modern Japan, not haunting a place, but an idea. But not everyone accepted the story as the media had told it. A countercurrent of writers and academics began to push back, arguing that the otaku killer label had unfairly stigmatized an entire generation. These critics said that Miyazaki's crimes were not born from anime or horror films, but from isolation and untreated psychological illness, things that had nothing to do with what he watched. They pointed out that millions of young men across Japan shared his hobbies, but only one had become a murderer. A professor of sociology at Tokyo University wrote, "What frightens us about Miyazaki is not the tapes. It is that he was one of us. He followed the rules. He worked, he paid his rent, he smiled. And he still did what he did." The words struck a chord. In the years that followed, filmmakers began to explore that discomfort. They stopped portraying monsters as strangers and started placing them in apartment buildings, office jobs, classrooms, anywhere that looked too familiar. Television dramas drew on the idea of the invisible man among us, and even romantic comedies began including characters described as otaku, those softened, redeemed by friendship and love. It was as if the culture itself was trying to rewrite the story, to make peace with what had happened. There were also documentaries, many of them restrained and reflective, interviewing investigators who were now old men. They spoke of the case with the tone of people describing a wound that never quite healed. One detective, his voice shaky with age, said, "When I saw that room for the first time, I realized how easy it is for someone to disappear without ever leaving home." That realization touched something deep in the Japanese soul. The idea of disappearing while still present, of vanishing inside one's own life, would later become a defining image of 21st century Japan. A new word entered public discussion: hikikomori, people who withdraw completely from society, locking themselves in their rooms for years. The phenomenon existed before Miyazaki, but it was his case that made the nation finally confront it. He had been an extreme, lethal version of something already growing in the shadows. At the same time, the victims' families became symbols of endurance. They spoke occasionally on television, not about revenge, but about the danger of forgetting. They asked people to remember their daughters not as victims, but as children who loved to draw, to run, to laugh. On anniversaries, some television networks would air quiet tributes, a single photograph, a few words, a moment of silence. Even now, the name Mari Kano appears each August on small memorial broadcasts. There was also the lingering mystery of how someone so deeply broken could function for so long without detection. Psychologists used his case in training programs to discuss empathy failure, the process by which the ability to feel others' emotions simply stops. They described it like a light that flickers for years before going dark. The lesson they taught was not only clinical, but moral. Neglect breeds silence, and silence breeds danger. Over time, Miyazaki's name faded from front-page news and became part of the background noise of history, but its consequences shaped the country's approach to mental health and media forever. The Japanese government began funding new studies into youth isolation. Schools started mental wellness programs. Universities created counseling centers for students struggling with disconnection. Television stations introduced content guidelines for violence. Yet, in the quiet corners of the internet, his name lived on. Forums discussed him, sometimes with morbid fascination, sometimes as myth. Younger generations who hadn't lived through the fear saw him as a symbol from an older, stranger Japan, a time before smartphones, before constant surveillance, when people could still vanish behind a closed door. His story became less about one man and more about a question: could it happen again? Books were written, most factual, some speculative. True crime authors re-examined the case, using it as a lens to explore the balance between repression and eruption in Japanese society. One novelist described him not as a monster, but as a mirror that shows what we refuse to see. The phrase stuck. His crimes also changed how Japan viewed its own media. Before 1989, horror was fantasy. After 1989, it became commentary. Directors like Kiyoshi Kurosawa and Takashi Miike began creating films that reflected the unease of real life, stories where isolation itself was the villain. In their worlds, ghosts were less frightening than the people who stopped feeling. Over the decades, the idea of Miyazaki blurred, from man to monster to symbol to cautionary tale. He became shorthand for everything that frightened Japan about its modern self: the loss of community, the pressure to conform, the quiet despair that can turn inward until it devours the mind. When you walk through suburban Japan today, especially in places like Saitama or Hano where his shadow first fell, life feels ordinary again. Convenience stores glow at night, children laugh on their way home, vending machines hum beneath flickering lights. But those who lived through that summer still say the air feels different. That sometimes, when the cicadas sing too loud, the sound seems to carry something else beneath it, a reminder that peace is fragile, and monsters rarely announce themselves before they arrive. And in that fragile calm, his story remains, not because anyone wants to remember him, but because forgetting him would mean forgetting what loneliness, unchecked and unseen, can become. Decades have passed since the arrest of Tsutomu Miyazaki, and yet, in the collective memory of Japan, the shadow he left behind still lingers. It has faded, yes, but like an old photograph stored too long in sunlight, the outline never truly disappears. Even those born long after the crimes feel the residue of his story. It became part of the cultural bloodstream, a parable whispered between generations about loneliness, neglect, and what happens when empathy collapses in silence. To understand why his case still endures, you have to understand how much Japan changed because of it. Before 1989, serial murder was rare in the country, the kind of thing read about in Western newspapers, not something that could happen in a quiet suburb north of Tokyo. The idea that such darkness could exist amid the politeness and orderliness of Japanese life shook people to their core. It didn't fit the narrative the country told about itself. After Miyazaki, everything from parenting to media consumption was examined under a new light. Families began speaking to their children more openly about safety, about strangers, about the dangers of the world. Schools held assemblies. Police launched new community awareness programs. For years afterward, every missing child's case was met with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The word Miyazaki became shorthand for danger, whispered with fear and disgust. But beneath that vigilance lay another transformation, one quieter, more introspective. Japan began to talk, reluctantly, about mental illness. About how shame and repression often turn pain into secrecy. The idea that a person could suffer quietly in a small room, spiraling into detachment, became a subject of documentaries and psychology papers. For the first time, government funding began to support programs for the socially withdrawn, those who could no longer leave their homes, who lived behind drawn curtains and the flicker of television screens. In a way, Miyazaki had forced a conversation Japan didn't want to have, the cost of silence. He had lived in silence for most of his life, his condition, his loneliness, his disconnection all hidden behind the polite mask expected of every citizen. And in that silence, something inside him had warped. Not overnight, not suddenly, but slowly, quietly, invisibly. His story was horrific, yes, but it was also cautionary, proof that monstrosity can grow in ordinary soil if no one dares to look too closely. Years later, documentaries would interview those who knew him, childhood acquaintances, neighbors, co-workers. Their recollections were all the same. He was quiet. He never caused trouble. He was polite. They struggled to reconcile the man they remembered with the crimes he had confessed to. And that contradiction became the final horror, that the face of evil could be indistinguishable from the face of normalcy. In modern Japan, his case is often discussed alongside other cultural shifts, the bursting of the economic bubble, the rise of internet isolation, the emergence of hikikomori culture. It became, in hindsight, one of the earliest signs that something deeper was happening in the social fabric, a loneliness that prosperity could not cure. When news of his execution broke in 2008, there were no public celebrations, no triumph, just a collective exhale. Newspapers printed headlines that morning not in bold, but in subdued fonts, as though trying to bury the memory rather than resurrect it. Television anchors spoke briefly, then moved on to other news. But for those who remembered, that day felt heavy, the closing of a long, unbearable chapter. The families of his victims did not speak publicly. They didn't need to. Their grief had already become part of the national conscience. In interviews years later, one father simply said, "People ask if justice was served. There is no justice for a child who never got to grow up." Today, if you visit the areas where the crimes occurred, you wouldn't recognize them. The empty lots are now small parks, playgrounds, apartment complexes. The trees have been cut down. The roads are wider. Time has done what time always does, paved over the scars. Yet there's a subtle weight in the air, as if the land itself remembers. Locals sometimes speak of it when summer comes, when the cicadas are loud and the nights feel too still. They say that every few years, flowers appear at the edge of certain wooded paths, placed by hands unseen. No one claims them. No one asks. And yet, for all the horror, something remarkable happened in the decades after his crimes, a reawakening of empathy. It began slowly, with psychologists, teachers, journalists, people who decided that the lesson of Miyazaki's life was not just to fear, but to understand. His case became a mirror through which Japan began to see the humanity it risked losing, the way people can vanish in plain sight, and how easily society looks away when strangeness makes them uncomfortable. He was, in every sense, a man who should have been seen earlier. A child who needed help. A teenager who needed connection. An adult who needed treatment. None of those things came. And what emerged instead was a vacuum, one that consumed others to fill itself. The true crime of Tsutomu Miyazaki wasn't only what he did to his victims, but what isolation did to him. Even today, his story is taught not merely as a tale of cruelty, but as a study of consequence, how a society's neglect can shape its monsters. In documentaries, when former detectives speak, their voices tremble less from fear than from sadness. One of them once said, "We didn't just catch a killer. We caught what happens when someone grows up invisible." Perhaps that's why his case continues to haunt. Not because of the brutality of his actions, but because of the recognition that his path could have been different, that somewhere between the boy in the printing shop and the man surrounded by videotapes, there might have been a moment where someone could have reached him. But no one did. And so the story endures, not as a tale of evil, but as a quiet, aching reminder of what it means to be unseen. When you listen to the cicadas in the deep Japanese summer, when the sound fills the air until it becomes a hum that blurs with your heartbeat, think of him, not in sympathy, but in understanding. Think of the children he took, the lives he ended, and the silence that allowed him to begin. Think of how peace can hide violence, how politeness can conceal despair, and how the distance between isolation and catastrophe is smaller than anyone wants to believe. Because that, more than anything, is the legacy of Tsutomu Miyazaki, a story not about monsters, but about people, and about what happens when the world stops hearing them. Good night.